It's the end of January, and I know a lot of you can't wait to get out and scout the woods. The hunting seasons are just about to a close, most of them, especially the upper north half of the country. And one of the favorite things for people to do, go in and look and see where those bucks are bedding from last hunting season, where they're bedding now. And there's a few tricks with that too. You really need to determine, and I've talked about that in another video, bucks that are bedding where they're at right now might not necessarily be where they're bedding in the fall. And you can tell by that if when the shavings were on the ground, if the shavings are on top of the snow, below the snow for rubs. You can tell if they are concentrated and heavy winter, fall food sources right now, and just really congregating yarding areas and conifers. So you can tell there's a lot of areas that are more winter cover related, and I find that a lot of those are adjacent to summer cover. So where bucks are at right now is not where they're necessarily at in the fall, but there's a lot of clues that can tell you where they're at in the fall. Several years ago, I wrote an article, Top 10 Buck Bedding Areas, and you can look it up on Google. And I went through 3 different habitat types, including a big wilderness hardwoods areas, flat ag land areas, and then hilly, hill country ag areas, non-ag areas. So those 3 groups. Went through the top 10 locations, 3 or 4 in each one of those spots. And like any of these topics, if you're scouting big buck bedding areas, just look, top 10 buck bedding spots, and you'll find my articles on Google, nocturnal bucks, trail cam strategies, whatever the focus you're on. I have over 600 articles online, whitetail articles, and so if you want to find my articles, a lot of times they'll come right up at the top. I do have them broken down in my website, but I really wanted to shoot a video on this. And this morning, the temperature literally hit minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit this morning, not wind chill. That was just actual temperature. So instead of shooting outdoors, which I like, we're shooting indoors, but that allows me to go through this article and illustrate some of these top 10 buck bedding areas that I want to share with you. And you really want to make sense of your scouting. So we'll talk about that in another video, but you really want to have a defined focus when you go into scout, and then you're using sign to verify what should be there in the first place. And so if you're thinking, yeah, this should be a great buck bedding area, or this should be a great cruising area, and on paper it makes sense, which we're going to show you it making sense here on paper, then with you going into that bedding area, when you go into that travel corridor and you find that sign, that historical sign where it might show rubs from a decade or more, then you can know this is a great bedding area, this is a great travel corridor. It made sense on paper first. Then you're not wasting your time going in there just purely looking for sign and making sense of it. You're actually saying this should be this spot on a map. You go in there and find it. And I'm going to show you right now where we find this. And the first, I love hunting different areas. I've hunted a lot of public land, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania. And I love public land areas because you can find areas where you can truly get away and find unpressured public land locations in every state within probably an hour or 2 hours of where you live, anywhere you go. So public land can be outstanding. Now, the first area, we'll show this on the map, is a marshland in the UP of Michigan, big hardwoods. This is similar to northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota. And you can even compare this to areas that might be some low, flat, brushy areas in Ohio, southern Ohio, Kentucky, southern Illinois, where you have that depth of cover, you have a lot of room for deer, and you have some isolated areas, and you have some marshes. I love hunting marshes because the land that is high really funnels deer movement, and you can go in and take a look at that. Now, the first area, isolated marsh islands, I love that because once you have mainland areas of hardwoods, fields, native prairie grass up north of Minnesota, whatever it might be, then that first edge cover located next to those big masses of land usually features doe bedding areas. And so those does want to bed close to the food, they want to bed to the hardwoods, they want to bed close to the native grass, maybe ag fields that go down to swamp. And then once you go out into the marshes and you find those isolated islands, then those are often the perfect areas to set up for a buck. And I'm showing those on here. You have to have that doe bedding near the edges, but then those isolated marsh islands are just perfect to get into. And you can get a little aggressive with those. It's a one area you can get a little bit aggressive because you can pinpoint buck movement and know that a certain buck's coming back to a certain island every single morning. Western Wisconsin, there's big flat areas of marsh and open public land, or eastern Wisconsin, sorry. There's areas where you can actually go back and say, I think a buck is coming in here, and you can afford to be aggressive, you can afford to pinpoint his location because they're very small areas. There might be an eighth of an acre, quarter acre. You can get in there before that buck comes. He has a long ways to go to get back there, 3/4 mile from where he's feeding and hanging out all night. And so you can get in there and say, I think he's going to come right back to this island with just a little bit of scouting, and lo and behold, he does. And a lot of times if you have a buck and you know that movement, that he's making that movement to those islands, you want to get on him right now, just because there's other people that might be looking at that same pattern. There's other people that might beat you to the punch, and you can go back in there on public land, and hey, if you mess it all up, wait 3 or 4 weeks, he might be back there again, or try a new spot, but you can afford to be a little bit aggressive. So I like those interior islands, but it all takes, you have to have those does bedding near the mainland, and then you find those little islands out there. And what's cool is I'll scout islands like that in the UP of Michigan, and I might even draw them out on a card, an aerial photo, or print off the topography map, and it just shows a 5 foot, 10 foot change in elevation. And I'll go back there and actually mark those areas, and it's pretty cool that you might be searching or really scouting 15 different islands, and only 3 of them have old buck sign or current buck sign. So you know which ones match up with the funnels that move through the swamps and connect to the mainland, and that'll typically connect the highest points too. So really love those interior islands out in those marsh areas. Now the interior ridge systems. Now those ridge systems a lot of times are high enough to where there might be a monoculture of conifers, might be spruce in there, even cedar swamps. They might just be 5 or 6 feet, but they meander for a long time. That monoculture is actually nice. So you're taking a monoculture of moving ridges through a swampland, through a marshland, and it's monoculture. But that means the edge of that monoculture, the edge of those ridges, where those ridges connect to other ridges, where those ridges connect to islands, that's where the change in habitat becomes. You change in elevation, change in habitat. So you go down to areas that are completely wet, and you might have tagalt or red oak or dogwood, and then it slips into stands of aspen, and then finally up to the upper areas. And we have some of those in the UP of Michigan that are red pine, cedar, all spruce, all conifer. And again, when you focus on those long, and I know some of those ridges that are running for a mile or more, and when you focus on the portions of those islands that are ridges that might get a little bit lower, that actually have sanctuaries in them, benches, and saddles, where it contains a diversity of habitat, then those are the areas that you key on. And you'll see a recurring theme with all of this: diversity, change in elevation, change in habitat. That's where you're going to find the deer. But again, it all starts with mainland, doe bedding, and then you're finding these interior ridges that are perfect for bucks, especially moving during the rut lengthwise. And if you focus on those changes of habitat, that's where you're going to find the food, and that's where you're going to find the focus of any does that are moving through the area too, but especially the bucks. And finally, the swamp edges themselves. Long swamp edges of drawn out areas of cover where you have the mainland, you have does on the mainland, and then you have swamp edges that extend out into the marsh far enough to where you can actually say 100 yards away from the main edge that there's mature bucks that are cruising there, bedding there, and they don't want to go any further because it gets hip high with water and muck, and so they'll actually parallel those edges. Great place for rutting activity, and if you can somehow get through the marsh or alongside the water in the high water areas and slip into where it's slightly dry, then you can wait for those bucks to come back to you. And you think, public land, a lot of times those bucks are 3/4 mile back into their bedding areas from their main food sources. But when you have water and you have water constrictions, and it creates a great opportunity to hunt those funnels and hunt those edges where there's enough depth to actually support daytime mature buck movement, especially during the rut, and especially those little points that might jut out into the marsh, but it's still that edge along the mainland where bucks can travel back to and bed within the morning hours. So I really love those swamp edges in those big wilderness areas, those interior ridge systems, and then of course those hidden islands that are away from doe bedding, and that you can pinpoint precision buck movement and even take an aggressive stance to go get that buck as soon as you notice that he's there, as soon as you scout and find him that he's in there. Really, in a lot of those islands, and especially on public land, you don't see a lot of sign unless those bucks are out there early, which they're typically up in the hardwoods in the big ag areas, and they start to get pushed back there in late October, November. They start to not mind crashing their antlers through there because they're not in velvet. So look for late sign in all those wilderness areas and swamp areas. And so the key to focus on in a lot of those areas is historical sign, and knowing that that sign will be there in late October, early November. Just plan on it. And if you know there's big bucks on the mainland, that they're going to be out in those locations. Next area that I've had a lot of experience growing up in southern Michigan and hunting private land, especially in the Thumb area of Michigan, which is almost completely flat, is basically low cover, flat agricultural settings. The key to this is it doesn't take a lot of cover to hold a mature buck because there's not a lot of cover available. So if you're looking for giant cover area, you're not going to find it. And if you're looking for bucks to be 500 yards back from a food source, you're just going back into the next ag field 150 yards away. So I grew up hunting these small woodlots of 5 and 10 acres and really keying on those locations where there might be mature bucks or might have enough cover to hold those mature bucks. And you can see up in the northeast corner of this particular map, where the blue is, when there's outlined in blue, that there's some really good buck bedding areas, and those areas actually had pasture and cow pasture to the northeast of those locations, and then you had the high quality ag to the south, no food plots or anything, but those does in yellow would stack up in between the ag and the bucks. So the bucks they couldn't be on that ag edge because the does going back and forth. They want a lot more cover than that. And so in those blue areas, that's where you'd find those mature bucks out on those tips of cover next to low quality pasture cover where a buck could actually sit back, have a reclusive area, and not be bothered by those does and small bucks every day. You'd see those does and small bucks back in the yellow areas. You can also see that and go back to that, just real quick, back to that wilderness area and those big hardwoods areas. All those areas in blue are either interior ridges, islands, and then all those areas in yellow are for doe bedding. You'll see that as we progress through these maps that were provided by Huntera. We did this, like I said, we built this article several years ago, and it's ranks really high on Google. You can find it easily, and check out these maps yourself too, either there or on here. But those areas where you have low quality habitat, and this is in the case of pasture, and then you have high quality ag on the other side, and you're just hunting little woodlots where you can't manipulate the habitat. Those areas happen to be some really nice thick swales. Those does are bedded up near the ag, and then you have enough room out towards the tips of the pasture. It might be someone's backyard, which is in the case of this, there's a couple backyards right there. And it's crazy to find those mature bucks bedding back in those areas, but there's no deer movement. It's at the back end of the movement, and outstanding areas to slip into in the morning and wait for those bucks to come back to you and get a precision point right on his bedding area. And you don't even have to find his bed because those areas are half acre in size. You just need to get on the downwind edge and get there in the morning and beat them. Wait till the end of October, early November, and try to go in and find that buck. Now, one of my favorite locations is I was able to hunt a 5 and 10 acre woods. And in those locations, the 5 and 10 acre woods, the 5 acre woods actually wasn't deep enough and big enough to actually hold bucks. But if you just went right adjacent to that, and this is a ditch system that went through both those properties, then there's a ditch system right through the middle of that 10 acre area. And if there were mature bucks in that woods, they were on that ditch system. So that woods was only 110 yards wide. So you're thinking in a quarter mile long, so you're really looking at a small area in between of 20, 30 yards. But there's some knolls in there along that ditch from where they created the ditch and for that drainage through there, and those bucks would sit right in the middle of that. And again, if you can go on the non-ag side that's productive at the time, you know, let's say there were beans early, they're already turned brown, maybe they're already harvested, maybe had their last cutting of hay on the north side in the ag field, you can slip in those low quality deer ag areas for the moment, have a stand on the north side of the ditches, and then wait for those bucks to come in there and move through that ditch line with a low probability of deer getting downwind of you because it was a non-food side for them. A lot of these little woodlots are really hard to hunt in the evening just because the deer, it's so tightly packed in there. It's really hard to get even close to those woods without just really spooking them far. And what's crazy in this is you'd see them go from 5 acre woods to 10 acre woods through a quarter mile of open ground, a quarter mile across the road, and then they're going into the neighbors and to the east, and it was 3/4 of a mile away, and then those deer wouldn't come back for several days. So you had to be very careful not to spook deer. And I think that's why it's so now I'm so paranoid of spooking deer off food plots, out of hunting blinds, educating the deer, because the lessons I learned in 1987 to 1997 hunting in southern Michigan flat ag land hold true today. And it really shapes how I do not want to spook deer at any cost, because a lot of times what that meant to me when I didn't have any big woods to hunt was that I didn't have any place to hunt for a week or two that might be productive until those deer came back. Now, deep woods opportunity. And you look at this aerial photo and there's not much woods on it at all, and it's mostly all river related or some really small woodlots. So deep woods there meant that you had a 30-acre patch of cover, a 20-acre patch of cover. And once you got to the center of that cover, like down there in the southwest where you see that blue area, that was a perfect area for potential mature buck to bed. You had the does towards the outside, quality bedding towards the ag side, quality bedding on the south side for does, and there's actually ag off the picture there. And really the only place left for bucks was in the middle. Now a lot of times what happens frequently is hunters will go in there and let's say they had 30 acres. Well, of course, the favorite place with all the sign is right in the middle of the parcel. If you go into the middle of that parcel, you're actually sitting where mature bucks would have been. By the time you leave a scent trail in and out, it doesn't matter how much you smell when you're on your stand. If you smell nothing at all, the deer can't tell you're there, which I don't believe can happen. But even if the deer didn't know you were there once you got to your stand, the invasiveness for you to go into the center of a 20 or 30 acre parcel is so high that you can kick mature bucks out to the point where there's not going to be any mature bucks in the area, or they're going to the next door neighbor, they're doing the same thing. The whole buck age structure is lowered. But by staying out of a 20 or 30 acre patch like that and letting that core interior area develop, no different than that ditch line 10 acre parcel, then you can actually have an area where the oldest bucks within a mile in any direction live during the daylight, because less than 5% of all those parcels in that area are going to hold daylight mature bucks. And you can bet they're going to be the ones that are 10, 20, 30 acres and have the appearance to the deer, the illusion that there's no hunting pressure. So you hunt the outside edges, you hunt the outside funnels, and a lot of times you're hunting in the evening in that case. And if you can slip in on the downwind edge of that bedding area, in this case there's a river. If the river is flooded at some point, you can blow your scent into that river, get there real early. I've done that before, harvested nice bucks back in the late 80s, early 90s. And that's a great way to slip into, and it might mean even crossing the creek in the morning, getting a little bit wet and getting into your stand location. But great place to find bucks in those areas, in those ag areas, even if you could just find 20, 30 acres. Now, the fourth area in this location is within the river system, and within the river system itself and the meanderings. What's great about the river systems, if you look on this map, they're down on the south side extending east and west, is that often ag is sandwiched up against that river system to the point where it might be 100 yards across to the next ag field, and there's some places it might even be 300 yards across. But there's a lot of deer compacted into that river bottom in a linear fashion. What's great about that, no different than the swamp edges up north and in big wilderness areas, is that you can expect to layer doe bedding in a linear fashion too. So the does aren't extending that far back into the cover. Again, they just want to bed here, feed here as close as possible, 75 yards from the cover, 50 yards from their favorite food every single afternoon. They want to make that movement, and then where they're at night doesn't really matter. But during their daylight movements, it's really compacted. So you can stretch a lot of the does along that entire linear river system movement. And what that does, even if there's only 100 yards of cover, again, going back to the 10 acre scenario or the 30 acre, you can have a space dedicated for bucks along the middle of that river system, and those bucks will travel up and down that river system during the daylight, especially cruising for does. What's really cool about that is you're gonna have areas of pinch points with ag that you can even see on here, where the ag on both sides, the north and south side, the east and west side of the river, compact very tightly. Those are areas you can get in the morning, not spook a lot of deer, but you can bet with almost a bow tie of cover on either side of that location and that pinch point that bucks are nearby. You can get in there in the morning. You can wait for those bucks to cruise during the rut, late October, November, and have a realistic expectation that in a mile of river bottom, you're gonna have bucks in your lap at some point and probably all day traveling through those pinch points, because you're actually in line with the cover that goes along and travels along that river, and you're getting into a non-invasive area. And then there might be those areas where you have low quality ag on one side of the river or the other, and you can get into a small patch of cover, let your scent blow out into the ag. You're only going into the woods 30 yards, and you're right into a 100-yard width of cover, right at the river's edge, right on those little mounds and ridges along the river, and you're right on top of those bucks. So outstanding spot to get in those river meanderings, just slip into the woods barely. You're typically not hunting more than 20, 30 yards into the cover, and you can expect bucks left to right movement all day in front of you, and you might even be able to get into a bedding area in that type of an area. And these type of areas are all over lower Michigan, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, northern Indiana, northern Ohio. So many areas that are flat, have river systems, small wood lots, and let's face it, it's a high percentage of where a lot of us hunt and a lot of us enjoy hunting, and certainly where I grew up hunting. So I love getting back to my roots, and that's one of my favorite areas. Now, extending forward, there's some great hunting, and I'll use it around here in Wisconsin as an example, southwest Wisconsin. You look to southern Ohio, portions of western Illinois, southern Indiana, portions of Iowa, Minnesota, many different areas where you have a lot of hills, Pennsylvania, and you have ag land mixed in, open pasture, and you have to learn to hunt those hills. And there's 3 very common locations that I find outstanding buck bedding areas in these hills. What's cool, and I hope with this video, if you've only hunted these areas, just fast forward. If you only hunt in northern, just stop there, whatever you want to do. But I'm hoping I'm offering something for everybody out there. In these extreme hill country areas, there's a lot of misinformation out there that bucks only bed high. And I've heard some that bucks bed low too. But folks, it all boils down to where the food's at. So if there's a lot of food up on top of the ridge and you have low valleys with a lot of cover, a lot of flats, a lot of ditch lines down in the bottom that have flattened out for even 10 yards, 20 yards, then if you have a big ag up top, like in areas of number 1 here, then you're going to have, in the blue areas, you're going to have bucks bedded low with the ag area up high. Low flats, hard to hunt. But even on low flats, if you can get on the upside of the draw or the drainage, the high side, in the morning your wind's going to be safe. And that's going to be the same theme with all of this. As long as you're high in the morning, you're going to be safe hunting these bedding areas. Those are the low flats. Some of my favorite areas where I found the consistent and most amount of bucks bedding in this particular map in this area, because a lot of times they're the most depth away from food and away from ag, and they're also the most remote, and they're the least hunter pressured. It's amazing how those mature bucks funnel into those areas every single year for their daytime bedding areas. The second areas, the side benches, side saddles, points, and those are those mid-elevation points. And those mid-elevation points a lot of times are great around here because you have ag in the bottom and ag up on top. Anything they can farm on the top, they're farming. Anytime they can farm in the bottom, of course they're farming if it's wide enough. So you're not going to have bucks bedding high or low because that's where the does are bedding. Again, the does are bedding by the food, bucks are bedding behind them. And in these flats and in these interior benches and small points, mid-level elevation changes where it's flat, you're going to have bucks stacked into there. And that's another great area. On this map, it's labeled number 2. But you have those benches, and you can see the high ranges up on top and then those mid benches on the side. And those number 2 areas are outstanding for buck bedding area. And again, it all boils down to they're pinched into those areas because there's food on top, food on the bottom. Don't let anyone tell you that bucks always bed high, always bed low. That's not true at all. Shoot, this is an area that only covers about 500 acres, and in this we have lots of quality bedding area types and low flats, benches, and then high points. Number 3, those high points, those high benches, high points that are almost at the top of the elevation. And here we're looking at an area that features elevation changes of almost 500 feet from top to bottom. And so I find a lot of those bucks up on top, on those knobs, on those benches, if it's well away from doe bedding, if it's well away from ag. So if you have ag going right up to that point, then you're going to have does on that point, and then there might be bucks bedded down in those mid-elevation benches below, but they're not going to be bedded right up on top with the does. They're going to be bedded behind. A lot of times around here we have rock outcroppings on those tops, so the bucks are bedding just below the rock outcroppings, away from the does, away from the ag, and that is an outstanding place for bucks to bed in hill country when you have the conditions of high ag, doe bedding potential still on the flat, maybe a rocky ground that they didn't ag or steeply sloping, and then you have the bucks bedded behind that. I love hill country because you can cheat the wind, and I have a ridge system that's similar to a lot of areas where you have the actual crest, which is the highest point of the ridge. It slopes down, and then where there's that first sharp break is the military crest. A lot of times when I'm still hunting in Pennsylvania, that's that point I'm going to the military crest in a spot where I have some big timber, big lumber, big logs, big trees that I can stalk behind, and I'm just looking over that military crest and seeing if there's deer below. That military crest is a great spot for bucks to bed when you have ag down below. Then you have the mid-elevation bench or point. That's that location where bucks like to bed when there's ag below and ag above, and it might be marshes down below where there's a lot of deer and there's diversity and change of habitat, and you have a lot of does. It might be CRP grasses up top, native grasses where there's a lot of doe bedding and their traditional fawning ground that they're hanging around for the fall, and then those bucks are in the middle. And then of course you have those lower flats. Some of the best areas around here that I personally hunt, and it didn't matter if it was north, south, east, or west, they came in from different directions, but you had those low elevation flats where there's some outstanding mature buck bedding because there's high ag above, and you know there's bucks coming out of that low flat every single day. They're going into that low flat every single day. You can depend on it. The worst thing you can do is go in there and hunt it because the winds are swirling, but if you can come in on a high side, steep break, get on a bench above it in any direction, make sure that your scent is going the right way. It's going up in the morning, it always going up. Make sure you're not blowing out a side bench or something up above where bucks traditionally bed. Maybe blow it into a very steep area, a very rocky area, which is what we've done. Or again, blowing it into the non-ag side of the valley where the ag up above is harvested beans, plowed fields, already had a last cutting of hay, and then you could have a reasonable expectation that you're not blowing a lot of scent up into an area that's stocked full of does because they're on the other side next to the better ags. They don't have to go down 350 yards and back up 350 yards every single day to get to their bedding. They're staying on the productive ag side for their bedding, and then those bucks are down below. Hope that makes some sense. I tried to cover a lot of buck bedding areas. I think that's why this article that we just went over is a popular one on Google. You can look it up, pretty easy to find. Just put in top 10 buck bedding areas. And it's a perfect time to scout. Maybe not today with it being starting to the day of -40. I think yesterday we hit a high of -12. But great time to get out and first look at aerial photos like this and say, bucks should bed there because does are here, here's the mainland, or does are around this ag edge. They're on this river system in the middle. Make some sense of it, and don't get too caught up in where the deer are right now because typically they're yarding and they're in areas where they're not during the fall. Go in there, find that perfect location on a map first, walk in there, hike, scout, and sure enough there's some old sign. You can find some sign from last year, and you really don't have to scout the whole river bottom. You really don't have to scout the whole hillside, and on public land you don't have to scout 10,000 acres. You can boil it down to a couple of hundred, make some sense of it, look for old sign, go in there, and voila, you found one of the greatest golden tickets of mature buck hunting where actually a buck beds during the daylight. Protect that, hunt that, make it a sacred area, and you can have an outstanding hunt this season.